The knock satisfies itself against the wood of the door at 636 Adam Street just before 8 in the morning. It is January 12th, 1943. The temperature in Waterloo, Iowa has not climbed above 10 degrees. Thomas Sullivan stands in his kitchen, dressed for the day shift at the Rath meatpacking plant. The smell of coffee still in the air, and he hears the car first. Tyres pressing into frozen gravel, an engine idling at the curb where no car ought to be idling this early on a Tuesday. Then the footsteps, dress shoes, not work boots. They cross the porch in a cadence that does not belong to a neighbour. He knows. In the space between the sound of the knock and the moment his hand reaches the doorknob, Thomas Sullivan already knows. The knowing arrives before language, before the faces on the other side of the door materialise into their gold braid and navy blue, before the lieutenant commander opens his mouth. It is a knowing that lives in the body, in the gut, in the sudden absence of air in the room. It is the knowing that every parent of every serviceman in every war-touched household in America has feared since December of 1941, except that for Thomas Sullivan, the mathematics of this knowing are 5 times worse. He opens the door. 3 naval officers stand on his porch in dress uniform, their breath visible in the frozen air, their faces arranged into expressions they have rehearsed. They are here about his sons, all 5 of his sons, George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert. They are here to say that the ship on which his boys served, all 5 of them together on the same ship the way they demanded it, has been at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean for exactly 2 months. Hold here. Hold on this image. A father in a doorway, winter light behind 3 dark uniforms, a frozen street in Iowa. Because what follows is not simply a story about 5 brothers who died in war. That story, most people think they already know. They know there were 5. They know there was a ship. They know there was a policy named after what happened. But most people do not know that these 5 men forced the hand of the United States Navy to keep them together when the Navy's own regulations existed precisely to prevent a catastrophe like this one. Most people do not know that the executive officer aboard their ship objected repeatedly to the arrangement that placed all 5 Sullivans in the same hull. Most people do not know that the parents standing in this doorway spent the month that followed not in seclusion, not in private grief, but on stages and factory floors across the country, selling war bonds while the Navy itself was still assembling the full account of how, exactly, their sons had died. Most people do not know that a mother named Alita Sullivan wrote to the Bureau of Naval Personnel before the Bureau wrote to her, that she broke through the silence first, demanding answers about rumours she'd heard in town, and that the Navy's formal notification arrived only after her letter forced the matter. This is not the story most people think they know. This is the story of what happened before that knock, and everything that happened after it. The town of Waterloo, Iowa, in the 1930s straddles the Cedar River like 2 fists pressed together at the knuckles. On the east side, the Rath Packing Company dominates the skyline, a complex of brick buildings and smokestacks that employs thousands, fills the morning air with the particular iron smell of rendered fat and blood, and organises the rhythms of working-class life as surely as any church bell. The men of Waterloo's east side rise before dawn. They walk to the plant in groups, lunch pails in hand, and they return in the late afternoon smelling of labour that most Americans prefer not to think about when they sit down to supper. It is hard work, physical work, the kind that builds a specific sort of man, broad-shouldered, plain-spoken, loyal to the people who share the labour beside him. Thomas Sullivan knows this world from the inside. A freight conductor by trade, he has worked the rails and the packing floors both, and by the late 30s he is employed at Rath alongside what seems like half of Waterloo's East Side Irish Catholic community. His wife Aletta keeps the household at 636 Adam Street, a modest frame house, indistinguishable from the houses on either side of it, on a street lined with elms that lose their leaves to the Iowa wind each October, in great sweeping clouds of gold and brown. The Sullivan household is not quiet. It has never been quiet. In a home with 5 sons and a daughter, quiet is a foreign concept. George is the eldest, born in 1915, which makes him 27 in the year everything changes. Francis is a year younger, 26, Joseph follows at 24, Madison at 23. Albert, the youngest brother, is 20. Genevieve, their sister, is 24 in 1942, positioned in age between Joseph and Madison, a fact that will matter later. These are not wide gaps. These brothers grow up in each other's pockets, in each other's shadows, in the particular closeness of a large family in a small house where privacy is a luxury no one can afford and no one especially wants. They attend Catholic school. They serve as altar boys. They play baseball in the lots behind the packing plant, where the grass grows patchy and the outfield ends at a chain-link fence. They swim in the Cedar River in summer, and when they are old enough, one by one, they go to work at Wrath. Not because they lack imagination or ambition, but because this is what young men in Waterloo do. The plant is the economy. The plant is the future. The plant is where your father works and your neighbours work and where you will work until something better comes along or until you die, whichever arrives first. George, the eldest, develops a reputation as the leader, the one the others follow, the one who makes the decisions for the group. He is tall, broad-faced, with the kind of easy authority that eldest brothers in large families either earn or impose. He earns it. Francis is quieter, more internal, the one who thinks before he speaks. Joseph has a sense of humour that can fill a room. Madison, called Matt by the family Ruz, is steady, reliable, the one you send when something needs doing correctly the first time. Albert, barely out of his teens, is still becoming whoever he will become. He has the youngest child's combination of eagerness and recklessness, the need to prove himself among brothers who are already men. They do not merely live together, they socialise together, drink together, go to dances together, double date in configurations that rotate with the seasons. Their circle of friends in Waterloo's east side overlaps so completely that it is impossible to know one Sullivan without knowing all five. They are a unit. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal description of how they move through the world, as a group, as a pack, as five parts of a single organism. The town knows them this way. Their friends know them this way. Their parents know them this way. It is the source of Aletta's pride and Thomas's quiet satisfaction, that their boys are close, that they look out for each other, that whatever the world throws at them, they face it together. Among their circle of friends on the east side of Waterloo is a young man named William Ball, Bill Ball. He is part of the fabric of their social life, the dances, the weekend gatherings, the easy camaraderie of young working-class men in a small Iowa city, where everyone knows everyone, and Saturday nights have a limited number of options. Bill is not a Sullivan, but he's close enough to be considered something adjacent to family, the way certain friends become in tight-knit communities where the boundaries between household and neighbourhood blur into irrelevance. No one in Waterloo is thinking about the Pacific Ocean. It is 1940, 1941, and the war is something that happens in newspapers, in radio broadcasts that Thomas listens to after supper, in the conversations men have at the plant about whether America will get pulled in and when. Europe is burning. China is bleeding. But Iowa is planting corn, slaughtering hogs, living the same life it has lived since the last war ended 20 years ago. The Sullivan brothers work their shifts, chase their girls, raise their glasses on Friday nights, and assume, as young men always assume, that the future will resemble the present, only more so. December 7th, 1941, arrives in Waterloo the way it arrives everywhere in America, through the radio. The first bulletins crackle through living rooms on a Sunday afternoon, and within hours the entire country understands that everything has changed. Pearl Harbor. The names of ships begin to surface in the days that follow, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and with them the names of the dead. The lists appear in newspapers, on bulletin boards, in the grim official telegrams that begin arriving at homes across the country. And in Waterloo, Iowa, one of those names lands like a stone dropped into still water. William Ball, Bill Ball, their friend, killed aboard the USS Arizona on the morning of December the 7th, when Japanese torpedoes and bombs turned the battleship into a burning tomb for over 1,100 men. Bill Ball is among them. He's 20 years old, or near enough, and he's gone. Not missing, not wounded, not convalescing in some Pacific hospital, but gone entirely, consumed by the fire and oil and seawater that swallowed the Arizona whole. The news reaches the Sullivan brothers through the channels that news travels in a town like Waterloo, a phone call, a word at the plant, a name overheard at mass. And the reaction, when it comes, is not the generalised outrage of a nation attacked. It is not the patriotic fever that sends thousands of young men to recruiting offices in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, though that fever is real and the brothers feel it. What the Sullivans feel is something more specific, more personal, more dangerous in its clarity. This is not about flags or freedom or the arsenal of democracy. This is about Bill. Bill is dead. Bill, who was at their kitchen table last summer. Bill, who dance with the same girls they danced with. Bill, who went into the Navy and ended up on a battleship in Hawaii and is now part of the wreckage at the bottom of a harbour on the other side of the world. Grief metabolizes differently in different men. In the Sullivan brothers, it metabolizes into something hard and sharp and pointed directly at the enemy. They want to go. Not individually, not separately, not scattered across the fleet the way the Navy would prefer, but together. All 5 of them, on the same ship. They want to fight the people who killed their friend, and they want to do it side by side the same way they have done everything else in their lives. The logic is emotional, not strategic. It is the logic of men who have never been apart and cannot imagine being apart even in war, especially in war. George, as the eldest, as the leader, articulates what the others feel. His words, as recalled later by family, carry the weight of a man who has already made his peace with the possible consequences. If the worst comes to worst, why, we'll all have gone down together. This is not bravado. It is not a young man's romanticized vision of glorious death. It is a statement of identity. They are Sullivans. They go together. Whatever happens, it happens to all of them, or it happens to none of them. The alternative, one brother safe while another dies, one brother home while another drowns, is more terrifying to them than the prospect of collective annihilation. On January 3rd, 1942, less than a month after Pearl Harbor, less than a month after Bill Ball's name appears on the casualty lists, all 5 Sullivan brothers walk into the Navy recruiting office in Waterloo together. George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert. 5 men, 1 family, 1 demand. They will serve together or they will not serve at all. The recruiter faces a problem. The United States Navy maintains a standing policy, born from precisely the kind of catastrophe that will eventually prove the policy's wisdom, discouraging the assignment of siblings to the same vessel. The policy exists because the Navy understands, in the institutional way that large bureaucracies understand risk, that concentrating a family's entire male line on a single ship is an invitation to the kind of loss that destroys not merely the men themselves, but the family and the community they leave behind. A single torpedo, a single bomb, a single catastrophic magazine explosion, and an entire family tree is severed at the trunk. But it is January of 1942. The nation is reeling. Recruiting offices across the country are overwhelmed with volunteers. The propaganda apparatus of the United States government is working overtime to channel American outrage into enlistments. And here, walking through the door, are 5 brothers. Photogenic, articulate, working-class Irish Catholic motivated by personal loss, who want to serve together. The story practically writes itself. 5 brothers, 1 ship, 1 fight. It is the kind of narrative that sells war bonds, fills newsreels, puts faces on the abstract machinery of national mobilization. The policy says no. The moment says yes. The Sullivan brothers are enlisted together. Their condition is granted. They will serve on the same ship. The decision is made somewhere above the pay grade of the Waterloo recruiter, made by men who weigh the propaganda value of 5 brothers serving together against the actuarial risk of 5 brothers dying together, and decide that the former outweighs the latter. Perhaps they believe the war will be short. Perhaps they believe the odds are in the brothers' favour. Perhaps they simply do not think about it very hard, because there is a war to win and recruitment quotas to fill and a nation to inspire. What no one in that recruiting office knows, what no one can know, is that this decision, this acquiescence to the Sullivan brothers' demand, will reverberate through the United States military for the rest of the century. It will rewrite policy. It will change law. It will become the reason future brothers are separated, future families protected from the specific and total devastation that is gathering, even now in the waters off Guadalcanal. The brothers are assigned to the USS Juno, a light cruiser of the Atlanta class, built for speed and anti-aircraft defense, commissioned in February of 1942. They report aboard, and they do so as a group, 5 brothers from Iowa, together on the same ship, exactly as they demanded. The Navy's policy bent for them. The recruiting apparatus celebrated them. Newsreel cameras eventually will find them. They are the Sullivan brothers, and they are going to war together. But not everyone aboard the Juno is comfortable with this arrangement. The ship's executive officer, the second in command, the man responsible for the daily management of the crew and the welfare of every sailor aboard, objects. He objects repeatedly. The historical record, as reported in the Waterloo Daily Courier's January 1943 Navy statement, confirms that the executive officer raised the matter more than once. His objections are professional, not personal. He understands what the policy exists to prevent. He understands that 5 brothers on a single warship is 5 brothers in a single blast radius, 5 brothers exposed to a single torpedo, 5 brothers dependent on the structural integrity of a single hull. He has seen what enemy ordnance does to light cruisers. He knows the math. His objections are noted. They are overruled. The Sullivans stay together aboard the Juno. The executive officer's protests become part of the administrative record, a paper trail that will haunt the Navy's institutional conscience for decades, because it proves that someone saw what was coming. Not the specific event, not the torpedo, not the battle, but the category of disaster. Someone aboard the Juno understood that keeping 5 brothers together in a combat zone was an act of tempting fate so brazen that fate would almost certainly respond, and that someone was overruled by the same institutional momentum that allowed the brothers to enlist together in the first place. The war goes on. The Juno deploys to the Pacific. The Sullivan brothers serve aboard her through the spring and summer and fall of 1942, as the United States and Japan fight a grinding, bloody campaign for control of the Solomon Islands. And in Waterloo, Iowa, Thomas and Aletta Sullivan go about their lives. Thomas to the Wrath plant each morning, Aletta to the routines of a household that is suddenly conspicuously empty of young men. And they wait. They read the newspapers. They listen to the radio. They write letters and receive letters and try not to think about what the absence of a letter might mean. The Pacific is very far from Iowa. The distance between Waterloo and Guadalcanal is not merely geographical, but conceptual. A distance measured in the incomprehensibility of what is happening out there, in the blue water and the green islands and the black smoke of naval battles that the folks back home can barely imagine. Thomas Sullivan goes to work. He comes home, he eats supper, he waits. He does not know that the waiting is almost over. He does not know that his 5 sons are already steaming toward a night action in the waters north of Guadalcanal that will become one of the most brutal surface engagements of the Pacific War. He does not know that a Japanese submarine designated I-26 is somewhere in those same waters, hunting. He does not know any of this on the morning of January 12, 1943, when a car rolls to a stop outside 636 Adams Street. He knows only the knock, the footsteps on the porch, the gold braid visible through the glass, and in the space between the sound and the opening of the door, he knows what 3 naval officers in dress uniform on a freezing Tuesday morning in Waterloo have come to say. But before that door opens, before the words are spoken, and the Sullivan family crosses the threshold between before and after, there is a night in November to account for. There is a battle. There is a torpedo. There is a ship that sinks in 42 seconds and takes nearly 700 men into the darkness with it. There is also a beginning. And the beginning is not the torpedo, not the battle, not the ship sliding beneath the surface of Iron Bottom Sound. The beginning is a recruiting office, a counter. 5 men standing shoulder to shoulder in a room that smells of floor wax and cigarette smoke and the particular bureaucratic stillness of government offices in small Midwestern cities. January 3rd, 1942. Des Moines, Iowa. 27 days after Pearl Harbor. The Sullivan brothers do not arrive at the Navy recruiting station uncertain. They do not arrive individually, staggering in over the course of days or weeks as the reality of war settles into their bones. They arrive together, all 5, a block. George is 27, Francis is 26, Joseph is 24, Madison is 21, Albert is 19. They have driven the 70-odd miles from Waterloo with their minds already made up, and they carry with them a condition that is not negotiable. They will serve together, on the same ship, in the same crew, or they will not serve at all. The recruiter behind the counter faces a problem. The United States Navy maintains a policy, not a regulation with the force of law, but a policy, a strong institutional preference, against assigning siblings to the same vessel. The reasoning behind this policy is not abstract. It is not administrative tidiness. It is the recognition of a specific horror, that a single catastrophic event, a mine, a torpedo, an ammunition magazine detonation, could erase an entire generation of a family in the time it takes to draw a breath. The policy exists because the Navy has imagined this scenario and decided it is unconscionable, The policy exists because someone, at some point in the institutional past, sat in an office and thought through the mathematics of concentrated loss and concluded that no military advantage was worth that particular cost to a single family. And yet, the 5 men standing at the counter are not asking, they are stating terms. They will serve together or they will walk out the door and return to Waterloo, and the Navy will have lost 5 able-bodied volunteers in the middle of the most urgent manpower crisis in American history. The timing matters enormously. This is January 1942. Pearl Harbor is less than a month old. The Pacific Fleet is shattered. Wake Island has fallen. The Philippines are under siege. The nation is reeling, furious, frightened, and desperate for men. Every recruiting station in the country has quotas to fill, and every recruiter knows that the bodies walking through his door today are the bodies that will crew the ships still under construction in the yards at Brooklyn and Norfolk and Puget Sound. Turning away 5 healthy, motivated volunteers, 5 men burning with the particular fury of personal loss, 5 men who want nothing more than to fight, is not a decision any recruiter wants to make. Not now, not in this climate of national emergency. The policy bends, the brothers enlist, together. It is worth pausing here, not to judge, but to understand the precise nature of what has just occurred. A rule designed to prevent catastrophe has been set aside in favour of expediency. The decision is not made by a single individual. It moves through the bureaucracy the way such decisions always move, passed upward and sideways through chains of approval where no single person bears the full weight of saying yes. The brothers insist. The recruiter notes their insistence. Someone above the recruiter approves. The paperwork is processed. 5 Sullivan brothers become 5 Sullivan sailors, and their demand, together or not at all, becomes an administrative fact, a line item in a personnel file that will travel with them across the Pacific. No one involved in that decision is a villain. The recruiter is doing his job in wartime. The approving officers are balancing competing imperatives, the policy against sibling assignment on one hand, the urgent need for volunteers on the other, and perhaps also an awareness that these 5 brothers from Iowa, with their dramatic demand and their story of avenging a fallen friend, represent something the war effort needs as much as it needs bodies. A narrative. A story of American resolve. 5 brothers, 1 cause, 1 ship. It is the kind of story that newspapers print and radio broadcasts repeat, and that other young men hear and think, if those 5 can go together, surely I can go alone. The moral question that will haunt this story for 80 years begins here, in this room, on this January morning, when an institution knows a rule exists for a reason, when that reason is the prevention of exactly the catastrophe that will eventually occur, and breaks it anyway. Where does responsibility lie? With the brothers who insisted. They are grown men, Americans, volunteers. They have the right to serve. With the recruiter who processed them? He is a functionary following the path of least resistance in a moment of national emergency. With the unnamed approving officers who signed off on the arrangement? They are making a calculated bet that the war will not find all 5 brothers at once, that the odds favour survival, that the policy is a precaution rather than a prophecy. The answer, of course, is that responsibility lies everywhere and nowhere. It is distributed across a system, diluted by good intentions and urgent necessity until no single hand holds it. This is how institutional failures work, not through malice, through accommodation, through the human tendency to make exceptions, to assume that the worst case is improbable, to prioritise the immediate need over the distant risk. The Sullivan brothers are not victims of cruelty. They are victims of a system that said yes when it should have said no, and kept saying yes all the way to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The USS Juno is commissioned on February 14, 1942, Valentine's Day, 6 weeks after the brothers enlist. She is an Atlanta-class light cruiser, hull number CL-52, built at the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Kearney, New Jersey. The Sullivans are assigned to her crew. They report aboard. They find their berths, stow their gear, learn the passageways and ladders and compartments that will constitute their world for the next 9 months. And almost immediately, a problem surfaces, or rather, resurfaces. The Juno's executive officer does not want 5 brothers on his ship. His reasons are the same reasons that produced the policy in the first place. He is the second in command, the officer responsible for crew management, for personnel assignments, for the daily functioning of a warship that carries roughly 700 souls. He understands, in the concrete and practical way that comes from actually running a ship rather than staffing a desk in Washington, what it means to have 5 members of a single family concentrated in one hull. He understands that light cruisers go into harm's way. That is their purpose. The Atlanta class is designed for speed and anti-aircraft defense. She is fast, she's bristling with guns, and she is thinly armored. Speed and firepower in exchange for protection. This is the bargain of her design, and her executive officer knows it. He knows that if the Juno takes a torpedo, not if, but when, because this is the Pacific in 1942 and every ship that sails into the combat zone accepts the possibility. Her thin armor will not save the men inside, and if those men include 5 brothers from the same family, from the same small town in Iowa, then a single torpedo becomes not merely a military loss, but a human catastrophe of a specific and terrible kind. He objects. The historical record is clear on this point. The Navy's own account, as reported in the Waterloo Daily Courier on January 12, 1943, confirms that the executive officer raised his concerns repeatedly. Not once, not as a formality, repeatedly. He goes through channels. He makes his case. He puts his professional judgment on the record. The brothers, a Navy personnel official later states, remain aboard at the insistence of the brothers themselves. Their determination overrides his professional objection. Their desire to stay together, rooted in love, in loyalty, in the promise they made to each other and to the memory of Bill Ball, overrides the institutional wisdom that exists specifically to prevent what is about to happen. The executive officer is overruled. Again and again, he is overruled. The decision to keep the Sullivans together aboard the Juno is not a single failure point. It is a chain of failures, each link forged by a different hand, each one a door that could have been closed and was not. The recruiting office in Des Moines, the personnel desk in Washington, the executive officer's own chain of command, whoever it is that hears his repeated objections and decides each time that the brothers will stay. Each decision is individually defensible. Each one makes sense in its narrow context, and collectively they form the path that leads 5 brothers to the same patch of ocean on the same night in November. There exists in the margins of this story one more detail, a detail that carries the particular weight of things that almost happened but did not. Historical accounts indicate that 2 of the Sullivan brothers were slated for transfer off the Juno upon her next return to port. The specifics require further verification. The documentary record is not entirely settled on which 2, or exactly when, the transfer orders were drafted. But the shape of the detail is clear. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, had finally acknowledged the executive officer's concerns, had finally decided that the risk was too great, that at least some of the brothers needed to be separated, that the policy which had been bent at enlistment needed to be partially restored. 2 of the 5 were to be moved to other assignments. The Juno simply needed to return to port one more time. She never did. This is the cruelest geometry of the story, not the single failure, but the near correction. The system was beginning to right itself. The executive officer's objections were at last bearing fruit. The institutional machinery was grinding slowly toward the decision it should have made 9 months earlier. And the war did not wait. The torpedo did not wait. The 42 seconds did not wait for the paperwork to clear. But before November, before the night action, and the submarine and the magazine detonation, there are months of service. Months of the 5 Sullivan brothers living and working and existing together in the confined spaces of a light cruiser at war. And this, too, is part of the story. Not only the catastrophe, but the ordinary days that preceded it. The days that were, for 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, both extraordinary and mundane. A light cruiser is not a large ship. The Atlanta class displaces roughly 6,000 tons, substantial by the standards of everyday life, modest by the standards of naval warfare. Her crew of 700 men occupy every available space. The berthing compartments are stacked with bunks 3 high. The mess decks are crowded at every meal. The passageways are narrow enough that 2 men passing must turn sideways. Privacy does not exist. Solitude does not exist. Every smell, every sound, every conversation belongs to everyone within earshot, which is everyone. Now place 5 brothers in this environment. 5 men who have known each other since birth, who share not only a surname but a set of mannerisms, a family vocabulary, a collection of private jokes and old grievances and unspoken understandings that no one else aboard can access. They are conspicuous On a ship of 700, 5 brothers are impossible to miss. They look alike. The Sullivan features repeated with variations across a 7-year age span. They sound alike. The flat vowels of eastern Iowa, the cadence of the same household. They move through the ship as a gravitational cluster, pulling toward each other during off-duty hours, eating together when watch schedules allow, sleeping in berths close enough to hear each other breathe. For the other men aboard the Juno, the 690-odd sailors who are not Sullivans, the brothers are a curiosity, a mascot, a unit within the unit. Some find it charming, some find it strange, some perhaps find it unsettling in a way they cannot quite articulate. A reminder that these are not merely sailors, but sons, brothers, someone's children, and that the war has a way of reaching into families with precise and terrible efficiency. The Juno deploys to the Pacific in the spring of 1942. She participates in operations around the Solomon Islands through the summer and into the fall. The 5 brothers serve through the grinding routine of wartime naval service, the watches, the drills, the long empty hours of transit punctuated by the sudden violent hours of combat. An Atlanta-class cruiser built for anti-aircraft defense spends much of her time shooting at the sky, throwing up walls of flak against incoming Japanese aircraft, the guns hammering so loud that men go partially deaf, the shell casings cascading across the deck in a brass avalanche. The brothers are somewhere in this, at their battle stations, doing their jobs, surviving each engagement and returning to the routine of shipboard life. George Sullivan, the eldest at 27, carries the authority of a big brother even here, even in a military hierarchy that technically supersedes family rank. He is the one who told their mother before departure the words that will define this story in the public memory. If the worst comes to worst, why, we'll all have gone down together. He means it as reassurance. He means it as a statement of fraternal solidarity, of the bond that brought them here in the first place. He does not mean it as prophecy. But language has a way of becoming prophecy when catastrophe confirms it, and these words will be repeated in newspapers and radio broadcasts and memorial plaques for the next 8 decades. They will become the Sullivan brothers' epitaph, written by George himself, months before the torpedo that made it true. The ship herself is worth understanding, because her design is inseparable from the fate of her crew. The Atlanta class is built around a specific tactical concept: speed and volume of fire at the expense of survivability. Her armour is thin, her hull is not compartmentalised to the degree of heavier warships. She is fast, over 32 knots, and she carries 16 5-inch guns in a configuration optimised for anti-aircraft work. She is, in naval terms, a specialised tool, excellent at her designed purpose, vulnerable to threats outside it. A torpedo, particularly one that strikes her magazine spaces, is not a threat she is built to survive. Her designers know this. Her officers know this. The trade-off is accepted because the fleet needs anti-aircraft escorts, and the Atlanta class fills that role better than almost anything else afloat. 700 men serve aboard this thin-skinned, fast-moving weapons platform. They live in the spaces between the ammunition hoists and the fuel bunkers and the boiler rooms, spaces that, if breached by a torpedo warhead, will become infernos or voids or both in the span of seconds. Every man aboard understands this at some level, the way everyone aboard any warship understands it, abstractly, distantly, as a possibility that applies to other ships, other crews, other wars, not to them, not today. The Juno sails through the Solomons campaign. She survives engagements, she shoots down aircraft, she does her job, the 5 Sullivan brothers do theirs. The executive officer watches them serve alongside 690-odd other men and carries the weight of his professional judgment. The objections raised and overruled, the knowledge that his ship is carrying a concentrated vulnerability that no tactical manual accounts for. He cannot separate them on his own authority. The decision has been made above him. He can only do his job and hope that the odds hold. By early November 1942, the campaign for Guadalcanal is reaching a crescendo. The Japanese are reinforcing their positions on the island with regular convoy runs down the passage that American sailors have taken to calling the Slot. The United States Navy is committed to stopping those reinforcements, and the battles that result are among the most savage naval engagements since Jutland. Surface actions fought at close range in the dark, ships firing at point blank by the standards of naval gunnery, collisions, magazine explosions, Vessels torn apart so quickly that their crews never reach the lifeboats. The Juno is ordered north toward these waters. The 5 Sullivan brothers go with her. The executive officer's objections are somewhere in a file. The transfer orders that might have saved 2 of them are somewhere in the pipeline. And the Japanese submarine I-26 is somewhere in the dark water ahead, patient and silent, waiting for a target. The night of November 12, 1942, is chaos made liquid. Iron bottoms sound. The stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Savo Island that has already swallowed so many hulls it has earned this grim nickname among the men who sail it, erupts into a surface action so confused that ships on the same side fire into each other. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan leads a column of 13 American vessels directly into a Japanese bombardment force of 14 ships under Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe. And what follows is not a battle in any orderly sense. It is a brawl. Searchlights stab across black water. Guns fire at ranges so short that shells do not have time to arc. The American cruiser Atlanta takes friendly fire and a torpedo in rapid succession. Callahan himself dies on the bridge of the San Francisco. Ships pass so close to one another that their crews can hear voices shouting in a foreign language across the gap. The Juno is in this column. She is doing what she was built to do, adding her guns to the fight, maneuvering at speed in tight waters, absorbing the shock of concussion through her thin hull plates. And sometime in the early hours of November 13, a torpedo strikes her. The source is almost certainly I-26, though in the confusion of that night, attribution is difficult. The torpedo hits forward, on the port side. It does not sink her, it cripples her. The damage is severe, her keel is compromised, her forward fire rooms flooded, her speed reduced, but she remains afloat. She remains a ship, however wounded. Her crew fights the flooding. Her engineers shore up what can be shored. She's still there when dawn begins to grey the eastern sky, and the surviving American vessels begin to withdraw southward, away from the killing ground. She joins a column of battered ships, the cruisers San Francisco and Helena, the destroyer escorts, limping toward Espiritu Santo and the repair facilities that might save them. She's making perhaps 18 knots, straining against her damage, her bow riding lower than it should. The 5 Sullivan brothers are somewhere aboard this wounded vessel. Whether they are together in the same compartment, whether they are spread across damage control stations, whether any of them are already injured, no account survives to say. What is known is that the ship is still afloat and still moving and still full of living men when the morning of November 13 begins to brighten over the slot. The column is not safe. The waters south of Guadalcanal are patrolled by Japanese submarines and the ships know it. They are zigzagging where their damage allows it. They are listening on sonar. They are watching the surface for the thin white line of a torpedo wake. But a damaged ship trailing a wake of oil is an invitation, and I-26 is still hunting. The torpedo comes from the starboard side. It strikes amidships, in the vicinity of the forward fire room, or, more critically, in the vicinity of the ammunition magazines that feed the Juno's 16 5-inch guns. What happens next is not a sinking in any conventional sense. It is an obliteration. The magazine detonates. The force of the explosion is so catastrophic that it tears the ship in two, and not in the gradual way that a hull might break under stress. The Juno comes apart with a violence that men on adjacent ships will struggle to describe for the rest of their lives. A column of smoke and debris rockets upward. Some accounts describe it as 1,000 feet high, a brown-black pillar of shattered steel and seawater, and human remains that mushrooms outward like a miniature atomic detonation. The sound arrives as a physical blow to the crews of nearby vessels. Men on the San Francisco, hundreds of yards distant, are knocked from their feet by the concussive wave. The ship simply ceases to exist. Where a moment before there was a light cruiser, 401 feet long, 6,700 tons of steel, 700 human beings with names and hometowns and families and futures, there is now a spreading circle of wreckage on the surface of the Pacific. Fragments of hull, oil spreading in a black slick, small objects that might be debris or might be men. The water closes over the spot with an indifference that is itself a kind of violence. 42 seconds. Some accounts place the interval as short as 20. The range reflects the difficulty of timing an event that occurs faster than the conscious mind can fully process. But the consensus of witnesses and naval records converges on a figure in that range. from the torpedo's impact to the moment the last piece of the Juno disappears beneath the surface, less than a minute passes, less time than it takes to read this passage aloud. 700 men. The vast majority die in the initial explosion, or in the immediate structural collapse that follows. They die in the magazine blast, in the fireball, in the inrush of water as compartments that were sealed one instant become open to the sea the next. They die trapped behind hatches that jam as the hull twists. They die in boiler rooms that become steam-filled coffins as pipes rupture. They die on deck, hurled into the water with such force that the impact alone is fatal. They die in ways that the human mind recoils from describing, and the documentary record mercifully does not dwell upon. 687 of the roughly 700 men aboard the Juno will not survive. The ship takes them. Among those 700 men are George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert Sullivan. 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, 5 men who demanded to serve together, who were granted that demand against regulation and against the professional judgment of their own executive officer, who lived and worked and slept in the same thin-hulled vessel through months of Pacific combat, and who now, in the span of seconds that no human decision can alter, face the consequence of that togetherness. The executive officer's objection was not bureaucratic fussiness. It was this. It was exactly this. The concentrated risk he identified in a memorandum becomes the concentrated catastrophe he foresaw. 1 torpedo, 1 family, 5 sons. The ships of Task Group 67.4 do not stop. This fact requires context to understand, though context does not erase its weight. Captain Gilbert Hoover, the senior surviving officer commanding the withdrawing column from the bridge of the Helena, observes the explosion. He sees the pillar of debris. He sees the surface where the Juno was, and registers what every experienced naval officer present registers, that an explosion of that magnitude is not survivable, that no crew could endure a magazine detonation of that force, that stopping his remaining ships, themselves damaged, themselves exhausted, themselves vulnerable, in waters confirmed to contain at least 1 active enemy submarine, would be to risk additional losses for the sake of recovering what he believes to be wreckage and bodies, not survivors. He is wrong. He is wrong in the way that reasonable men making rapid decisions under extreme duress are sometimes wrong. Completely, catastrophically, and with consequences that compound across days. But in the moment, with the information available to him, observing an explosion that appears to have atomized an entire warship, his decision is not irrational. It is, by the grim calculus of wartime command, defensible. He orders the column to continue south. The Helena and the San Francisco and the destroyers steam away from the spreading oil slick without launching boats, without signaling for search aircraft, without confirming whether any human being in that water is still drawing breath. Approximately 100 to 115 men survive the initial explosion. They surface in the oil slick, burned, wounded, deafened by the blast, coated in fuel oil that stings their eyes and fills their mouths. They cling to whatever wreckage buoys them, fragments of decking, life jackets that may or may not be their own, pieces of wooden gratings, anything that floats in the churning aftermath. Some are grievously injured, shrapnel wounds, broken bones, burns that cover significant portions of their bodies. Some are relatively unharmed physically, but are already in the early stages of shock. All of them watch the wakes of the departing task group grow smaller against the horizon and understand, with a clarity that needs no explanation, that they have been left behind. George Sullivan, the eldest, the natural leader, the one who spoke for all 5 at the recruiting station in Des Moines, survives the blast. He surfaces in the oil-covered water. He is alive. His brothers are not beside him. In the chaos of 700 men dying simultaneously, in the confusion of an explosion that ripped a ship in half and scattered its contents across a square mile of ocean, the togetherness that defined the Sullivan brothers' service has ended. George is alone in the water or among strangers, calling out across the slick for voices that do not answer. The first hours in the water establish a pattern that will hold for the next 8 days. The survivors cluster in loose groups around whatever flotation they can gather. They call out to one another to maintain contact, to establish who is alive, to create some fragment of human order in a situation that has no order. The wounded begin to die, quietly some of them, slipping from consciousness and then from their holds on debris, sliding beneath the surface without protest. The The sun rises fully and begins its work on men who have no shade, no fresh water, no protection from the equatorial Pacific. The sharks arrive. They come to the oil and the blood and the movement. They come in numbers that vary by account. Some survivors will recall a handful, others will describe the water as thick with dorsal fins cutting the slick. They come with the patience of animals following an instinct that predates human civilization by millions of years, and they begin to feed. Men who survived a torpedo and a magazine explosion, and the sinking of their ship now face death by increments. A bump from below, a brush against a leg, and then the sudden, terrible violence of an attack that turns the water around a man red, and leaves his companions screaming and thrashing and pulling closer together in groups that offer no real protection but serve some atavistic need for proximity. A B-17 bomber crew flying a patrol route overhead spots the survivors. The aircrew can see them from altitude. Oil-smeared faces turned upward, arms waving, the desperate semaphore of men who see rescue approaching. One of the crewmen will later report the scene, all of them waving their arms, the white grey of their faces visible where they had wiped off the oil. The bomber crew drops supplies, or attempts to, and reports the sighting. But the message encounters what can only be described as a systemic communication failure. It does not reach the right command with the right urgency at the right time. The reasons are multiple and mundane. Radio channels overloaded by the ongoing battle, message routing procedures that add hours of delay, the sheer organisational chaos of a campaign in which ships are being sunk and launched and damaged on a daily basis. The men in the water do not know that they have been seen and then lost again in the paperwork of war. They only know that a plane passed overhead and no ship came. 8 days. The duration alone is almost beyond comprehension. 8 days in the open Pacific, without fresh water, without food, without medical attention for the wounded, under the equatorial sun by day and in the cooling water by night, surrounded by sharks that return and return and return. Men die of their wounds. They die of dehydration. They die of exposure. Some die of despair, simply releasing their hold and allowing themselves to slip beneath the surface, choosing an end on their own terms. Some die of madness, the psychological collapse that extreme deprivation and terror produce, the hallucinations and paranoia that turn shipmates into threats, an empty ocean into rescue ships that are never there. George Sullivan descends into this madness. The accounts of his final hours come from the men who survived alongside him. 10 men, ultimately, who will be pulled from the water and who will carry these memories for the rest of their lives. They describe George calling out for his brothers. "Al, where are you? Red, Matt, Frank, answer me. Where are you? It's your brother George." The names are nicknames and given names alike. The intimate language of a family shouted across open water, received by no one but strangers. The brothers do not answer. They are dead already, or they are dying elsewhere in the scattered groups, or they are simply too far away for a voice to carry. George does not stop calling. He is not the composed, steady eldest brother who spoke to officers and wrote to his parents and told his mother that, if the worst came, they would go down together. He is a man broken by grief and exposure and thirst, and the knowledge that the bond which brought him here, the bond he championed, the condition he insisted upon, has become the instrument of his family's annihilation. Survivors recount his final moments with the terrible specificity of men who were close enough to witness but powerless to intervene. George announces that he is going to find buttermilk. He says it with the calm certainty of a delirious man stating an intention that makes perfect sense within the architecture of his hallucination, and then he swims away from the group into the open water, away from the raft or the wreckage or whatever tenuous platform has kept him alive for days. He swims toward nothing, and he disappears. The eldest Sullivan brother dies not in the torpedo explosion, not in the magazine detonation, not in the 42 seconds that take his ship. He dies days later, alone, mad with grief and thirst, calling out for brothers who cannot hear him, swimming toward a phantom promise of comfort. He dies because no ship came. He dies because Captain Hoover made a decision, and a B-17 crew's report vanished into the fog of communications, and 8 days passed before anyone with the authority to order rescue acted on the knowledge that men were alive in that water. 10 survivors are ultimately pulled from the sea, 10 men out of 700, 10 men to carry the memory of what those 8 days contained. The Juno's crew is gone, not merely killed in battle, but killed and then abandoned and then consumed by the ocean over the course of more than a week. The 5 Sullivan brothers are among the dead. All 5. The condition they demanded at the recruiting station in Des Moines has been fulfilled in the only way that a warship's sinking can fulfill it. They served together. They died together. George's words to his mother have become prophecy, as words spoken in confidence so often become prophecy when fate is sufficiently cruel. And in Waterloo, Iowa, nobody knows. The Navy knows. The Navy has known since November 13, 1942. It knows that the Juno is gone, that her crew is overwhelmingly lost, that the Sullivan brothers, whose unusual enlistment arrangement made them notable within the service, are among the dead. This knowledge exists in official channels, in casualty rosters being compiled in offices far from Iowa. But knowledge within a bureaucracy and knowledge delivered to a family are two vastly different things, separated by procedures and protocols and the simple, grinding slowness of a military notification system overwhelmed by the scale of its task. The Pacific Campaign is producing casualties at a rate that strains every administrative capacity the Navy possesses. Ships are being sunk, men are dying. Notification letters must be drafted, reviewed, routed through command structures, matched against personnel files, verified against survivor lists that are themselves incomplete and evolving. The process is not designed for speed, it is designed for accuracy, because the one thing worse than telling a family their son is dead is telling them incorrectly, then correcting it, then losing their trust in every subsequent communication. The system prioritizes getting it right over getting it fast. This is defensible in theory. In practice, for the Sullivan family, it means weeks of silence that grow heavier with each passing day. Waterloo is a small city. Its men serve together because they enlisted together, and information, partial, unconfirmed, whispered, travels through networks that the Navy does not control. Rumours begin to circulate, not specific, not official, but present. Something has happened, something involving local boys, something bad. The Sullivans hear these rumours the way a family hears rumours in a small Midwestern city during wartime, indirectly, incompletely, without confirmation, and without any mechanism to demand the truth from an institution that has not yet chosen to deliver it. Aletta Sullivan, mother of 5 sons aboard a single warship, begins writing letters. She writes to the Navy. She writes with the controlled desperation of a woman who suspects the worst and needs someone in authority to either confirm or deny it. Her words, preserved in the National Archives, carry the weight of that 2-month silence. If anything has happened to my 5 sons, please let me know the truth. Not which one. Not how bad. She asks about all 5 because she knows, has always known since the day they left, that their fates are inseparable. The condition that sent them together means that whatever has happened to all of them, or none of them. There is no partial answer available. The letter reaches the Navy in early January 1943, and the Navy, confronted with a mother's direct plea, can no longer allow the bureaucratic process to unfold at its own pace. The notification must come. It comes on January 12, 1943, 2 full months after the torpedo struck, 2 months after 700 men died in 42 seconds, and 100 more died over 8 days in the water, 2 months after George Sullivan swam into the empty Pacific calling for his brothers. 2 months of silence, ended by gold braid on a porch on Adams Street in 10-degree cold. Thomas Sullivan is getting ready for work. It is a Tuesday morning. The routines of wartime homefront life proceed as they always proceed. Factories running, shifts beginning, a city going about its business while its sons fight in places most of its residents cannot find on a map. Thomas hears a car stop outside. He hears footsteps on the porch. He hears the knock that every parent of every service member dreads, with an intensity that civilian language cannot quite capture. He opens the door. 3 men in navy blue stand on his porch, gold braid on their shoulders, official bearing in their posture, and something in their faces that tells him everything before they speak a word. Thomas Sullivan looks at these officers and asks a question that reveals, in 4 syllables, both his hope and his knowledge of its futility. Which one? The officer's response ends the possibility of a partial grief, a survivable loss, a wound that might heal because some of his sons remain. The response is quiet and final, and it contains the full weight of November 13 and the 8 days after and the 2 months of institutional silence that have brought this moment to his doorstep on the coldest morning of an Iowa winter. I'm sorry, all 5. The words hang in the frozen air between the doorway and the porch. All 5. Not 1 son lost and 4 spared, not 2 and 3 remaining. All 5. The arithmetic of the Sullivan family's gamble, together, always together, resolves in a single officer's sentence into the worst possible sum. Thomas Sullivan stands in his doorway, and the world he occupied 30 seconds ago, the world of a Tuesday morning, of a shift to catch, of coffee cooling on the kitchen table, ceases to exist. It is replaced by a world in which he is the father of no living sons. The lieutenant commander, the doctor, the chief petty officer, they have come as a trio because protocol demands it. The doctor is present for precisely this reason. The physical collapse that grief can trigger, the heart that may stop, the body that may buckle. Thomas does not collapse. He stands in the doorway, and behind him, deeper in the house, Aletta hears the voices. She comes to the door, she sees the uniforms, and she knows, has known for weeks, has known since the rumours began circulating through Waterloo's tight-knit network of wartime families, has known since she sat down and wrote that letter to the Bureau of Naval Personnel. She knows what these men have come to say. But knowing and being told are different species of pain, the suspicion that lives in a mother's chest like a cold stone is not the same as the official declaration that transforms suspicion into fact. Aletta Sullivan has spent weeks in the space between those 2 states, writing her letter, waiting, listening for the mail carrier, passing every silence for meaning. Now the silence ends. Now the stone in her chest becomes a gravestone, 5 gravestones, and the Navy stands on her porch delivering the news she demanded they deliver. Because that is what the record shows, clearly and without ambiguity. The family's first confirmation comes not as an act of institutional compassion finally reaching its intended recipient, but as an answer, belated, forced by circumstance, to a mother who stopped waiting and started demanding. The timeline, reconstructed from naval records and the Waterloo Daily Courier's reporting, makes this sequence unmistakable. In early January 1943, a local mother in Waterloo receives a letter from her own son serving in the Pacific. The letter mentions, in the oblique way that censored wartime correspondence permits, that something has happened to the Sullivan boys. The rumour spreads through the small city with the velocity that only small city rumours achieve, across fences, through church pews, over telephone lines, in the aisles of grocery stores. It reaches Adam Street. It reaches Aletta. And Aletta does not wait. She does not sit in her parlour hoping the Navy will eventually find the time and the certainty to tell her what has happened to her children. She writes. Her letter to the Bureau of Naval Personnel is direct, stripped of pleasantry, aimed like a weapon at the bureaucratic wall that has separated her from the truth for 2 months. I am writing you in regards to a rumour going around that my 5 sons were killed in action in November. If it is so, please let me know the truth, if it is so. 3 words that carry the full weight of a mother's refusal to accept uncertainty as a permanent condition. If it is so, meaning she has not yet given up the final threadbare possibility that the rumours are wrong, that some miscommunication has occurred, that at least one of her boys might still be alive somewhere in the vast Pacific, but also meaning she is ready, if the truth is what she fears, to receive it. She is not asking to be protected from the answer. She is asking to be told. The letter arrives at the Bureau of Naval Personnel in Washington, and the Bureau, already in possession of the confirmed casualty reports, already aware that all 5 Sullivan brothers perished aboard the Juno on November 13. The Bureau is confronted with the particular bureaucratic embarrassment of a mother who knows before she has been told. The notification process, designed to be careful, to be accurate, to protect families from premature or incorrect information, has in this case achieved something else entirely. It has forced a grieving mother to seek out her own grief, to chase it through official channels, to write a letter asking the government of the United States to confirm what a rumour in a small Iowa city has already told her. January 12, 1943. The officers arrive at Adam Street. Whether their visit was already scheduled through the normal notification pipeline or whether Aletta's letter accelerated the timeline, the historical record does not resolve this question with certainty. What the record shows is simultaneity. The official notification and the Navy's response to Aletta's inquiry converge on the same day, the same doorstep, the same moment. the system catches up to the mother, not the other way around. Inside the house on Adams Street, after the officers have spoken and the door has closed and the navy blue has retreated back to whatever vehicle brought these men to deliver their message, the Sullivan household enters a grief that no framework in American life has been designed to contain. The loss of one child in wartime is a tragedy recognized by every culture, supported by every institution of consolation. The loss of 5 children, all at once, all in the same 42 seconds, on the same ship they demanded to share. This has no precedent in the family's experience, in the community's experience, in the nation's wartime experience. There is no protocol for this grief because there has never been a need for one. Thomas Sullivan, railroad conductor, father, Iowan, he asked, which one? Because the question assumed a universe in which partial loss was possible. The answer eliminated that universe, and in its place stands a reality so total in its devastation that the mind resists accepting it in a single moment. 5 sons. George, who coached the others, who kept them together, who went mad in the water calling their names. Francis, who followed George in everything. Joseph, who laughed easily. Madison, who was quiet. Albert, the youngest, barely 20, who wanted to go wherever his brothers went. All of them, simultaneously, permanently, irrevocably gone. The next day, January 13, 1943, a letter arrives from the White House. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt has written personally to Thomas and Aletta Sullivan. The letter is preserved in the National Archives, and it reads as what it simultaneously is: a genuine expression of presidential sympathy for an extraordinary loss and an instrument of wartime communication, carefully composed to honor sacrifice in a way that serves the broader narrative the nation requires. Roosevelt acknowledges the loss. He praises the brothers' service. He offers the consolation available to a commander-in-chief who has sent millions of young men into harm's way and must, in cases like this one, reckon with what that decision costs individual families. The letter is not hollow. Roosevelt's sympathy, by all accounts, is real. But the letter is also not merely personal. It is a document produced by an administration that understands, with the sophisticated clarity of Roosevelt's wartime communication apparatus, that the Sullivan story is going to become public, is going to become a symbol, is going to be wielded in service of the war effort whether the family consents to that use or not. The condolence letter is the first move in a longer sequence that will transform Thomas and Aletta Sullivan from grieving parents into public figures, from a family destroyed by war into a family that serves the war even in its destruction. But that transformation lies ahead. In this moment, January 13, the letter freshly opened. Thomas and Aletta Sullivan are simply parents in a house that held 7 people and now holds 2. The bedrooms upstairs, the belongings left behind, the photographs on mantels and in frames, all of it unchanged since the boys left for Des Moines on that January morning a year ago, and all of it now artifacts of a world that will never resume. What follows over the subsequent days and weeks is a collision between private grief and institutional need, between the Sullivans' desire to understand exactly what happened to their sons and the Navy's inability, in January and February 1943, to provide that understanding. Because the truth, uncomfortable and documented, is this: the Navy itself does not yet know the full story of how the Sullivan brothers died. It knows the Juno was torpedoed, it knows the ship sank, it knows the crew is gone, but the specific circumstances, who survived the initial explosion, who made it into the water, who died of wounds, and who of exposure, and who of sharks, and who, like George, of madness and despair. These details exist only in the fractured memories of the 10 men pulled from the ocean after 8 days. Those survivors are scattered across field hospitals and recovery wards in the South Pacific. Their accounts, when they can give them, are fragmentary, contradicted by trauma, distorted by the delirium of exposure. The after-action reports from the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal are themselves confused documents. The battle was fought at night, at close range, in conditions that made accurate reporting nearly impossible even for the ships that survived intact. Rear Admiral Callahan died on his bridge. The command structure fractured. Ships fired on their own. The Juno was already damaged when the torpedo struck, already limping south, already in the shadow of catastrophe before catastrophe arrived. So when Thomas and Aleta Sullivan attempt to learn what happened to George, Francis, Joseph, Madison, and Albert, specifically individually in the particular way that parents need to know, the Navy cannot tell them, not because it is withholding information, but because it does not possess the information. The institution that failed to notify the family for 2 months now fails in a different way. It cannot offer the granular truth that grief demands. It can confirm death. It cannot narrate it. It can acknowledge loss. It cannot explain it. The family learns gradually in pieces over weeks, from the accounts of survivors, from official communication, from the slow accumulation of fragmentary reports, something of what happened aboard the Juno in its final moments. They learn that the torpedo struck amidship. They learn that the forward magazine detonated. They learn that the ship broke apart and sank in a time frame so brief that most of the crew never had the chance to reach the deck. They learn eventually that some men survived the sinking only to die in the water over the 8 days before rescue arrived. They learn about George, his survival, his delirium, his final swim into the empty Pacific. Each piece of information arrives not as a complete narrative, but as a fragment to be assembled, a shard of a story that no single witness observed in its entirety. The parents must construct their sons' deaths from inference and imagination as much as from confirmed fact. This is a particular cruelty of naval warfare in 1942. The ocean leaves no evidence, offers no body to bury, provides no scene for a family to visit or a grave to tend. The Sullivan brothers are simply gone, absorbed into the same iron-bottom sound that holds dozens of warships and thousands of men from both sides of the conflict. And then there is the question that the family cannot ask publicly, the question that nevertheless hangs over every piece of information they receive. Did this have to happen this way? Not the torpedo. That is war. That is chance. That is the submarine commander doing his job. But the presence of all 5 brothers on a single ship, that is not chance. That is a decision. A series of decisions made by identifiable people at identifiable moments in the chain that led from a Des Moines recruiting station to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound. The brothers demanded to serve together. The Navy acquiesced despite policy. The executive officer of the Juno objected, repeatedly, formally through channels, and was overruled. Historical accounts indicate that had the Juno survived its next return to port, at least 2 of the brothers were slated for transfer to other ships. The Rogers brothers, another set of siblings serving aboard the Juno, successfully transferred off the ship weeks before it sank. Evidence that the mechanism existed, that the policy was being enforced for others, that the exception made for the Sullivans was precisely that, an exception. The family does not receive this information in a single briefing. It emerges over time, in fragments, in the same piecemeal fashion as the details of the sinking itself, and it forces a reckoning that no condolence letter, however presidential, can address. The tragedy aboard the Juno was not merely the product of an enemy torpedo. It was the end result of a sequence of decisions. The brothers' demand, the Navy's capitulation, the executive officer's overruled objections, the never-processed transfer orders, each of which represented a point where the outcome could have been different. Not the sinking. The sinking was war. But the presence of all 5 Sullivans aboard when the torpedo struck, that was policy, failed and bent and ignored until it could not be recovered. The Navy, in January and February 1943, is not prepared to acknowledge this publicly. It cannot say, "We knew this was dangerous, we were told by our own officer that it was dangerous and we allowed it anyway." It cannot say, "2 of your sons were supposed to be transferred and we did not process the paperwork in time." These admissions, even if they might bring a different kind of closure to a family seeking answers, carry implications that extend far beyond one family's grief. They implicate the institution itself. They suggest that the system designed to prevent exactly this outcome was aware of the risk, attempted to mitigate it, and failed through a combination of acquiescence to family pressure and bureaucratic delay. So the Navy offers what it can: confirmation of death, fragments of narrative, official sympathy, presidential condolence. It does not offer accountability. And the Sullivans, Thomas and Aleta, their daughter Genevieve, the extended family in Waterloo, are left to assemble meaning from incomplete information, to grieve sons whose final hours can only be partially reconstructed, to sit with the unanswerable question of whether 5 deaths might have been 1 or 2 or none had different decisions been made at different moments by different men. The cold of January deepens over Waterloo. The house at Adam Street absorbs the news and begins the long process of reconfiguring itself around absence. 5 gold stars will eventually hang in the window, 1 for each son, the maximum possible display of sacrifice, a visual declaration that this household has given everything that can be given. But in these early days, the stars have not yet been hung. The official letters are still being written. The full public revelation of the Sullivan story is still being managed, still being shaped by the wartime communication apparatus that understands, with professional clarity, that this family's loss possesses a symbolic power that transcends the merely personal. Thomas Sullivan goes to work. The railroad does not stop because 5 men have died. A letter tends the house. The groceries still need buying, the furnace still needs coal, the mail still arrives each morning with its mix of bills and condolences and official correspondence. Grief, in wartime, does not exempt anyone from the machinery of daily life. The war continues. The Pacific Fleet continues its operations. The slot runs at Guadalcanal continue. Men continue to die in numbers that make 5 brothers, however extraordinary their story, a statistical footnote in the larger calculus of global conflict. But the Sullivan story is not going to remain a footnote. The machinery is already in motion, the presidential letter sent, the narrative taking shape in offices in Washington, where men whose job is wartime morale recognize what they possess in this family's sacrifice. A knock is coming, different from the first one, not officers bearing news of death, but officials bearing requests of a different kind. The nation needs the Sullivans now, needs their grief made visible, their sacrifice made useful, their loss transformed into something that serves the living. The war bond drives need faces. The shipyard workers need motivation. The home front needs to understand what it is fighting for, and what the cost looks like when it arrives at a single doorstep on a single street in a single Iowa city. That knock has not yet come. For now, in the deep cold of January 1943, Thomas and Aleta Sullivan sit in a house full of ghosts and attempt to comprehend a loss that comprehension cannot hold. 5 sons, 42 seconds, 2 months of silence, a letter written in desperation, answered by gold braid on a frozen porch. This is where the story pauses, in the space between private grief and public obligation, between a family's need to mourn and a nation's need to use that mourning for purposes larger than any single household can contain. The knock comes in February. Not gold braid this time, but civilian suits. Men from the Treasury Department's War Finance Division, who have driven from Des Moines with a proposition wrapped in the language of service. They sit in the parlour at 636 Adam Street, the same room where Thomas and Aleta received the news barely a month before, and they explain what they are asking. The war bond program needs spokespeople, not celebrities, not generals, not politicians, families. Real families whose sacrifice is beyond question, whose presence on a stage or a factory floor can accomplish what posters and radio spots cannot, make the cost of the war immediate, physical, undeniable. They are asking Thomas and Aleta Sullivan to tour the country, to stand before crowds of strangers and speak about their sons, to visit the shipyards where vessels like the Juno are being built, where riveters and welders work double shifts to replace the ships the Pacific is consuming, to appear at war bond rallies in cities they have never seen, in front of audiences who know their name from newspaper headlines, but have never looked into the eyes of a mother who buried 5 sons without bodies, without graves, without even certainty about how each one died. The Sullivans agree. What compels them to say yes remains, at this distance, impossible to fully reconstruct. Patriotism is part of it. The same current of duty that sent 5 brothers to a recruiting station 13 months earlier runs through the parents as well. Grief's need for purpose is part of it. The terrible restlessness of loss that demands motion, demands that the absence mean something beyond itself. Aleta will later explain it in her son's own words. They always wrote her to keep her chin up. After their ship went down, she remembered what they said, and made up her mind to see what she could do to help win the war, to carry on for their sake. But there is something else operating beneath these explanations, something the documentary must hold without resolving. The institution that failed to protect their sons that bent its own policy under pressure, that drafted transfer orders and never processed them, that left survivors floating for 8 days, that took 2 months to notify a family, is now asking that family to serve as its most potent emotional instrument. The war bond program is not charity, it is finance. Every dollar raised builds another ship, trains another battalion, purchases another 1,000 rounds of ammunition. The Sullivans' grief, made public, is a revenue-generating asset. The men from the Treasury Department understand this with professional precision. Whether Thomas and Aleta understand it in the same terms is another question entirely. They begin touring in the spring of 1943. The itinerary takes them to shipyards on both coasts. The yards at Bath, Maine, and Newport News, Virginia, the massive Kaiser facilities in Richmond, California, where Liberty ships slide down the ways at a pace that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. They appear at manufacturing plants in the industrial Midwest, at rally stages in cities large and small. Thomas wears his railroad man's suit. Aleta wears a dark dress, and the composed expression of a woman who has decided that composure is itself a form of service. They stand before thousands. The mechanics of these appearances follow a pattern. A local official introduces them. The crowd, workers in coveralls, women in factory aprons, families with children, fall silent. Thomas or Aleta speaks. The words vary by occasion, but the substance remains constant. Their boys gave everything. The audience must do its part. The war will be won if the home front holds. Then the bond pledges come, hands rise, wallets open, payroll deductions are signed. The grief of one family, transmitted through the simple fact of their physical presence, converts into measurable economic output. The Treasury Department tracks the numbers. The Sullivan appearances correlate with spikes in bond purchases at every venue they visit. What this costs the parents cannot be measured in the same ledger. Each appearance requires them to inhabit their loss publicly, to hold it open for strangers to witness, to resist the natural impulse toward privacy that grief demands. They are performing mourning in the service of a war effort that has not yet accounted for its own role in producing that mourning. No one on the tour stages mentions Navy policy on sibling assignment. No one mentions the executive officer's objections. No one mentions the unprocessed transfer orders. The Sullivan story, as the war bond program tells it, is pure sacrifice. Noble, uncomplicated, suitable for conversion into national purpose. The questions that would complicate that narrative, questions about institutional responsibility, about whether 5 deaths were preventable, about what it means to honour a sacrifice the system itself produced through negligence, remain unasked in public, whatever form they may take in the private hours between appearances, in hotel rooms in unfamiliar cities, in the long train rides that carry Thomas and Aleta from one stage to the next. The tour continues through the summer and into the fall. Waterloo becomes something they leave and return to. The house on Adams Street, a way station between obligations. The town itself has absorbed the Sullivan story into its identity. The 5 gold stars in the window, the family whose loss exceeds any other in the community. The name that transforms a mid-sized Iowa railroad city into a symbol of wartime sacrifice recognized across the nation. But symbol-making is a process that happens to people, not one they control, and the Sullivans on stage are not entirely the Sullivans at home, where the silences are longer and the questions have no audience. At some point during these months, the exact timing is difficult to pin down, Genevieve Sullivan begins to move toward a decision of her own. She's 24 years old. She has watched her parents convert grief into public service. She has absorbed the family's particular brand of patriotism, the Irish Catholic working-class sense of duty that does not question whether the institution deserves the offering, only whether the offering is being made. And she has lost 5 brothers, not in the abstract way the nation has lost them, as symbols and headlines, but in the specific way that means 5 empty chairs at Christmas, 5 voices absent from phone calls, 5 futures that will never unfold. On April 6, 1943, less than 5 months after the Juno went down, less than 3 months after the notification arrived, Genevieve enlists in the Waves, the women accepted for voluntary emergency service, the women's branch of the United States Naval Reserve. She joins the same Navy that took her brothers. The decision carries a weight that no enlistment paperwork can capture. It is, on its surface, an act of patriotism consistent with everything the Sullivan family has demonstrated since January 1942. when 5 brothers walked into a Des Moines recruiting station with vengeance and loyalty and youthful certainty coursing through them. It is simultaneously a form of grief, the same restless need for purpose that put Thomas and Aleta on tour stages, the need to move toward the loss rather than away from it, to remain inside the institution where her brothers lived their final months, because leaving it would mean accepting a separation that nothing else in her life has made real. There are no graves to visit. No bodies were recovered. The Navy is the last place her brothers existed. To serve in it is, perhaps, the closest thing to proximity that remains available to her. But it is also something harder to name. Genevieve Sullivan, enlisting in the waves, is the surviving child of a family that has already given the maximum possible sacrifice to an institution that failed to prevent that sacrifice when prevention was within its power. The executive officer objected. The transfers were drafted. The policy existed. And still 5 brothers died together in 42 seconds because the machinery moved too slowly or not at all. For Genevieve to offer herself to that same machinery, voluntarily, knowing what she knows, understanding what her parents have been told about unprocessed paperwork and overruled objections, is an act that resists simple categorization. It is faith or defiance, or both or neither. It is a 24-year-old woman deciding that the meaning of her brothers' deaths will be determined by what comes after, not by what went wrong before. She trains. She serves as a specialist recruiter in Chicago, then as a yeoman in Seattle. 21 months in uniform. People ask her how her family can carry on after the tragedy. She answers that they are carrying on for them, for her 5 brothers and others like them who have died for their country. The words echo her mother's explanation almost precisely. The Sullivan family's shared language of purpose and continuation, of chin up and carry on, of converting unbearable loss into forward motion, because stopping would mean confronting a grief that has no bottom. Her service intersects with the passage of a new policy, one that bears her family's tragedy as its origin, even if their name does not appear in the official language. The War Department's sole survivor policy, designed to ensure that no American family again suffers the total loss the Sullivans endured, moves through the bureaucratic channels and takes effect. It establishes that surviving family members may request reassignment or discharge to prevent total family loss in military service. The policy's existence is, in bureaucratic language, an acknowledgement. It says, this should not have happened. It says, the system that allowed 5 brothers to serve and die together was flawed, and the flaw has been identified, and a mechanism now exists to prevent its recurrence. It says everything the Navy has declined to say directly to the Sullivans themselves, that the deaths were, at least in part, a systemic failure, a consequence of policy overridden and safeguards ignored. Genevieve is eventually granted an honourable discharge under the provisions of this same policy. The regulation inspired by her brothers' deaths becomes the instrument of her own return to civilian life. She goes home to Waterloo, to Thomas and Aleta, to the house on Adams Street where 5 gold stars hang in the window, and the absence of 5 suns has become the permanent architecture of daily existence. The tour has ended. The Bond drives have moved on to other faces, other stories. The war grinds toward its conclusion in Europe and the Pacific, consuming men and material at rates that make even the Sullivan tragedy one loss among hundreds of thousands. The decades pass. Thomas Sullivan dies. Aleta Sullivan dies. Genevieve lives on, carrying the family's story forward, answering the same questions, keeping the memory alive in a nation that moves with increasing speed away from the specifics of the Second World War and toward the generalities of memorial. The 5 Sullivan brothers become part of the cultural furniture, referenced, honoured, occasionally invoked in discussions of military policy, their photograph reproduced in textbooks and museum displays. The details that complicate their story, the objections overruled, the transfers unprocessed, the 8-day abandonment in the water, the 2-month notification delay, fade from public memory, leaving behind the cleaner narrative of sacrifice freely given and nobly borne. The Juno herself lies on the floor of the Pacific, 4,200 meters below the surface, in the waters off the Solomon Islands, where Iron Bottom Sound earned its name from the sheer volume of metal the war deposited there. For 76 years, no one knows her exact coordinates. The dead, nearly 700 men, including 5 brothers from Waterloo, Iowa, rest in a location that exists on no chart, that no family can point to on a map and say, there, that is where they are. In 2018, a research expedition changes this. The vessel Petrel, funded by the estate of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen, whose deep-sea exploration program has already located multiple lost warships of the Pacific War, finds the wreck. The Juno lies broken on the seafloor, her hull split where the torpedo detonated the forward magazine 76 years earlier, the violence of her end still legible in the arrangement of steel on the ocean bottom. The discovery occurs on St. Patrick's Day, a coincidence that carries its own weight for the Irish-American family whose name has been synonymous with the ship since November 1942. The finding gives the dead a coordinate, a point on the map, a place that can be named and referenced and, in whatever limited way the ocean permits, visited. It does not return the bodies. It does not answer the unanswerable questions. It does not undo the 42 seconds or the 8 days or the 2 months of silence or the tours that converted grief into bond revenue. But it closes something, gives the loss a geography, anchors it to the physical world in a way that death certificates and memorial plaques and gold stars in windows cannot. 2 United States Navy destroyers have carried the name USS the Sullivans. The first, DD-537, launched in 1943, served through the remainder of the war and into the Cold War before being decommissioned and preserved as a museum ship in Buffalo, New York. A vessel whose very existence is a memorial, whose name on the hull declares that the Navy remembers what happened and honours it, even if the full complexity of what happened remains largely unexamined in the official telling. The second, DDG-68, is a guided missile destroyer commissioned in 1997 and still in active service. Still sailing, still carrying the Sullivan name into waters where the next generation of sailors serves under a policy regime shaped directly by what 5 brothers from Iowa demanded and what that demand ultimately cost. George Sullivan once wrote home from the Juno. The letter, like all wartime correspondence, passed through censors and arrived in Waterloo bearing whatever news was permitted and whatever feelings could survive the distance between the South Pacific and Adams Street. In one of those letters, he expressed the brothers' shared conviction in a single sentence. They would make a team together that could not be beat. He was wrong, in the way that young men at war are often wrong about their own invulnerability. But he was also right about something the sentence did not intend to say. The 5 Sullivan brothers, by insisting on staying together, by refusing the separation that policy recommended, and an executive officer repeatedly urged, made themselves into something that could not be undone, a unit so complete that its destruction became total, a team whose togetherness guaranteed that if any of them fell, all of them fell, a bond so absolute that it admitted no partial outcomes. They could not be beat, they could only be lost entirely. The nation asked the Sullivans for everything. First it asked for 5 sons, then it asked for the parents' grief, packaged and performed across shipyard stages and bond rally platforms. Then it asked for the daughter, 21 months in uniform. Then it asked for decades of memory keeping, of ceremonial appearances, of bearing witness to a sacrifice that the country needed to believe was purely noble because the alternative, that it was partly preventable, partly the product of institutional failure, partly the cost of a system that bent its own rules and then failed to process the corrections, was harder to carry, harder to build monuments around, harder to stamp on the hull of a warship. The Sullivan family gave everything that was asked. The question the documentary leaves unanswered, because history itself has left it unanswered, is whether what was asked was fair, whether the exchange was just, whether a nation at war has the right to convert one family's total loss into an instrument of collective purpose without first accounting for its own role in producing that loss. The Navy acknowledged the failure obliquely through policy change. It never acknowledged it directly to the family. The sole survivor policy stands as both memorial and confession, a regulation whose existence declares that the system failed while declining to name the failure with specificity. 76 years of ocean silence, 5 brothers who would not be separated, a mother who wrote a letter because no one would tell her the truth, a father who opened a door to gold braid and cold air, a daughter who walked into the same institution that took her brothers and served 21 months because stopping was not something Sullivans did. And on the floor of the Pacific 4,200 meters down, in the dark where no light reaches and no sound carries, the Juno rests in the position her death assigned her, broken, silent, finally found, holding 700 men in a grave that has no marker but a set of coordinates and the memory of 42 seconds, that took everything from everyone all at once together.